What if I told you that in the 19th century, families didn't separate the living from the dead, not even in their photo albums? It sounds impossible to us now, but back then, death was not a visitor. It was a constant resident in every home, a quiet presence at every table. Parents tucked their children into bed each night, knowing that by dawn, one breath might be missing. Siblings learned to hold hands tightly, because life could vanish between one heartbeat and the next. And so, in a world where tomorrow was never promised, memory became the most precious form of survival. Photography had only just arrived, fragile and miraculous, and families clung to it with a desperation we can barely imagine. For many, a single portrait was a once-in-a-lifetime chance, and sometimes that lifetime had already ended. But here's the part that will stay with you. They did not hide these images. They did not place them in secret boxes or mark them with warnings. They slipped them gently into family albums, right beside weddings, childhood birthdays, and summer picnics, because for them the dead were not erased, they were simply held closer. And as we open those albums today, we are forced to ask a question the Victorians never feared. What does it mean to remember someone who no longer breathes? They called the photographer not to capture death, but to delay its disappearance. In the 19th century, when loss struck without warning, the act of preparing a body for a final portrait became something far deeper than a practical ritual. It was a conversation between the living and the silence that had just arrived. Families washed the skin gently, as if touch could still warm it. They chose clothing not to imitate life, but to honor the moments that life had held. A child's Sunday dress, a father's best coat, a mother's favorite shawl worn only on holidays. Nothing here was staged to deceive. Everything was arranged to remember. The room itself became part of the ceremony. Curtains were drawn to soften the harsh daylight. Candles flickered with a trembling glow. Shadows stretched long across wooden floors. The photographer moved quietly, almost reverently, adjusting the tripod as though afraid to disturb the peace. He waited for the stillness, not because the body required it, but because the family did. And when the image finally appeared, faint at first, then sharpening into a familiar face, there was a moment when everyone held their breath, not out of fear, but out of something far more fragile. For just that instant, it felt as if the person they loved had stepped back into the room, not alive, yet not entirely gone. There was a moment in the 19th century when families sat beside the dead, not with fear, but with a quiet, aching tenderness. These portraits were not staged for illusion. They were created to hold together what grief was trying to tear apart. When a child died, the mother often gathered the siblings close, not to pretend their sister still lived, but to let the camera capture the last time their faces would ever share the same frame. In many of these images, the living lean in slightly, instinctively, as if their bodies remembered the warmth that the camera could no longer find. A father might rest his hand on the shoulder of a son who would never walk again, the gesture steady, not trembling, because this was the final chance to show the world that love had not been buried with him. A wife might sit beside her husband, their chairs touching, her gaze calm, resigned, not to mask pain, but to honor the bond that death had dared to interrupt. These portraits were intimate in a way we can hardly fathom today. They were not proof of tragedy. They were proof of connection. Proof that even when breath failed, belonging did not. Families did not photograph death. They photographed togetherness one last time before the world changed forever. There is a particular kind of Victorian photograph that unsettles even historians, the ones where you cannot immediately tell who in the frame has already crossed the threshold of life. These images were never meant to deceive, yet they hold a strange, quiet tension, a stillness so delicate it can take more than a century to recognize. In many portraits, the dead appear almost indistinguishable from the living, not because anyone tried to mask death, but because families posed with a gentleness that blurred the boundary. A slight rigidity in the fingers, the unnatural ease of a shoulder, the way the eyes lacked their usual glimmer, small details that meant nothing to the people standing beside them. They knew. They did not need clues. Only we, looking back from the safety of another century, search for signs that were never intended for us. Sometimes the truth reveals itself in the most unexpected places. The child who remains perfectly sharp while everyone else is blurred from breathing. The mother whose posture seems too still in a world that trembles. The faint trace of a support hidden beneath clothing. These photographs are puzzles created without meaning to be solved. They remind us that death does not always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly among the living, unnoticed, until time teaches us how to see. In the 19th century, the family album was not a shrine to joy. It was a complete record of a life, with no pages withheld from sorrow. The dead were not isolated in their own section, not marked or labeled, not separated by mourning borders. Their photographs were slipped gently between moments of celebration, a wedding portrait on one page, a child's first steps on the next, and there, without any special announcement, the final image of someone who would never grow older. To Victorian eyes, this was not strange. It was honest. Life did not divide itself into chapters of happiness and grief. It wove them together, and the album reflected that truth without hesitation. A picture of a laughing toddler might sit beside the serene stillness of a deceased sibling. A mother holding a newborn could be followed by the same mother dressed in mourning black. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was disguised. The dead remained part of the family story just as naturally as the living. And because of this, these albums read differently to us today. We turn the pages expecting joy and suddenly find silence. We expect life and suddenly see its absence. Yet this contrast reveals something profound. The Victorians understood that memory does not belong only to the moments we choose to celebrate. It belongs equally to the moments we fear, the ones we try to forget. And so their albums became something we have lost, a place where love did not end simply because a heartbeat did. To modern eyes, it seems almost impossible to imagine a family placing a photograph of their deceased child or parent into an album without marking it, without a date, without even a quiet note acknowledging their passing. But in the 19th century, silence was not avoidance, it was reverence. Victorians did not need ink to confirm what their hearts already carried. Everyone in the household knew the truth of that still face, the day it was taken, the grief that lingered in the air. Writing "dead" beneath a portrait would have felt like diminishing the person to a condition rather than honoring them as a member of the family. Instead, they were preserved in the album exactly as they had been preserved in memory, without boundaries, without labels, without the coldness of explanation. A post-mortem photograph was not a secret. It was simply another chapter in a life that had ended too soon. And when descendants open these albums today, the absence of such labels creates a strange, haunting intimacy. For a moment, we see the images the way the family once did, not as artifacts of death, but as reminders of belonging. The Victorians did not sign their grief, they lived with it, and their albums carried that quiet, dignified acceptance forward for generations. A century can turn a simple photograph into a riddle. When descendants open Victorian family albums today, they do not expect to uncover secrets. They expect nostalgia, familiar stories, maybe a forgotten name or two. But then comes the moment that changes everything. A face they have seen their entire lives, an aunt, a great-grandfather, a child whispered about in family lore, suddenly reveals itself as someone who was no longer alive when the shutter clicked. At first, it feels like a misunderstanding. How could this calm, composed figure have already crossed into death? But the clues begin to surface, the unnatural stillness, the too-balanced posture, the quiet expression that does not quite belong to the living. And suddenly, the viewer realizes that they have grown up loving an image born from loss. These discoveries happen again and again in attics, archives, and private collections. A granddaughter learns that her favorite baby picture is actually a memorial portrait. A historian identifies a hidden support under a dress. A collector notices the faintest sign of retouched eyes. Time, which once protected the family from the harshness of grief, now reveals what they never felt the need to hide. These revelations are not frightening, they are intimate. They remind us that memory can outlive truth, and that sometimes the dead stay with us much longer than we ever knew. The disappearance of post-mortem photography did not happen overnight. It faded slowly, like a candle burning down to its last fragile glow. By the early 20th century, the world had begun to rearrange its relationship with death. Hospitals replaced parlors as the place where final breaths were taken. The body, once tended lovingly at home, was moved behind doors meant only for professionals. Families no longer washed the skin of their dead or dressed them in familiar clothes or prepared them for a portrait that would hold their memory. Death became something managed, something distant, something sanitized. And as photography grew cheaper, faster, and available to more people, the need to capture a final image simply vanished. Families now had dozens of portraits taken throughout life. They no longer depended on that one, last fragile picture to remember a face. But the deeper reason lies not in technology, but in fear. The modern world chose to hide death, to soften it, to bury it under routines and white hospital walls. The Victorians welcomed it into the family album. We pushed it into silence. And so the tradition, once tender and intimate, slipped quietly out of culture, not because it became unnecessary, but because we became unwilling to look. When we look at Victorian family albums today, we are struck not only by the images themselves, but by the worldview behind them, a worldview almost unrecognizable to us. These families did not turn away from death. They let it sit at their tables, sleep in their rooms, exist within the very structure of their memories. They understood something we have forgotten, that to love someone is to carry every part of their story, even the part that ends. Their albums reveal a tenderness sharper than grief, the belief that remembering is an act of loyalty, not morbidity. The dead were not shadows to be erased, but members of the household whose presence simply changed form. And in that acceptance lies a message for us. We photograph everything now, every smile, every trip, every fleeting moment, yet we rarely acknowledge the truth that terrified generations before us, far less than it terrifies us now, that every life, no matter how brightly it burns, narrows toward silence. The Victorians did not hide from that silence. They framed it. They gave it a place among the living. And their albums whisper what we struggle to face, that love is not measured by how long someone stays, but by how fiercely we refuse to forget them once they are gone. There is a moment when closing a Victorian album that feels almost like extinguishing a candle. The faces on its pages, the living and the dead held together in fragile harmony, seem to linger in the dimness long after the cover falls shut. Their stillness is not empty. It is watchful, as if every portrait is waiting for someone, decades or even centuries later, to meet their gaze again. And when we do, something unexpected happens. We realize that the people in these images have outlived their own time more fiercely than they could ever have imagined. They remain in the world not through breath or movement, but through the stubborn persistence of memory captured on paper. The Victorians believed that a likeness could preserve a soul's echo, and perhaps they were not entirely wrong. For when we look at these photographs now, the distance between then and now collapses for a heartbeat. We feel the presence of a child whose laughter was never recorded, a mother whose voice has long disappeared, a man who once stood in a room now lost to dust. Their eyes, living or lifeless, still meet ours. And in that quiet, impossible connection, we understand the truth the Victorians accepted without fear, that the dead never fully leave us, not while someone is willing to turn the page and look back.